in this second section, we'll be dealing with the final verses of Daniel chapter 11, from verse 40 to the end, which will deal with the period of history or time that we live in now. And I say it as the period of history because Daniel chapter 11 covers 2,500 years of history. And we're going to talk about the last 100 years of 2,500 years. So we might be talking about events which occurred before you were born. They certainly were before I was born. But in the big picture, from Daniel's perspective, it is very much the final times. All right, so as it's been said, a picture says 1,000 words. Probably seen that picture before. But here we have up on the screen the picture about a man reaching over, taking control of Crimea. And you may say that's old news. Putin did that a couple of months ago. Well, I'd suggest to you it's not necessarily old news, because you'll see this headline which occurred on July 15. It says, Russia threatens nuclear strikes over Crimea. The foreign minister had said that if Crimea chooses to try, the Ukraine chooses to try to take Crimea back, they will potentially be using nuclear weapons to remain in control of the Ukraine. That takes the whole problem in that little area of Europe to another whole level, doesn't it? Takes it, steps it all up just another notch. I mean, you think about the nature of what's going to occur if nuclear weapons start getting used in Europe. Russia, as part of their doctrine of defence, says we have the right to first act. We don't need to wait for someone else to use it. America works on that basis. Russia doesn't.
You've got the example of Chernobyl.
They're not talking about
Sure.
Because Putin was the one that actually brought back in the first strike policy.
He brought it back in, absolutely. So all I'm trying to show us is the issue that we have here in Crimea is not done and dusted. The issue in Ukraine is still going on. Just today, in the early hours of this morning, there was a military plane shot down, they believe, by the Russian Air Force.
Yeah. What sort of plane? American or Russian?
Ukraine.
Yeah.
Defence aeroplane was shot down by a Russian, potentially, Air Force.
No.
They're not sure. They don't think it was ground, they think it was air, the way it was attacked.
Now it was ground.
Are they?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was on the 6 o'clock news.
Okay, all right, there you go. I checked it lasted 5-ish, so there you go, then I will. There you go. Now, the last thing is you've got about 12,000 troops that are now on the border of Ukraine. So things are still going on. We're talking July. Even though the focus in our news might have moved off from it, this is still important news. So as much as we put up here on the slide, it's old news, well, the effect of what is occurring is still working its stages behind the scenes. And that's what we need to look at.
It's had this spark wave.
It has, absolutely. So you'll see the next graphic here shows an invasion that's coming down from the north down here towards the Holy Land. So down through the Middle East, and it ends up down here in Egypt. There's lots of questions that come out. I mean, you see here, there's a bunch of soldiers on the ground, but you also see this graphic shows like a flood with all boats and ships. We need to pick up those ideas and those themes from what we're going to read in Daniel chapter 11. You'll see here as we come to the end of it, he ends up here in Egypt. Daniel chapter 11 says potentially he goes further around here into the area of, and I have an absolute mental blank, into the area of the Libyans and further south to the Ethiopians. We'll have a look at those details. But you might be looking at that thinking, well, how do we know that this is going to be Putin? How do we know that it's going to be Russia? Where does it say that in Daniel chapter 11? It doesn't say that in Daniel chapter 11. But by piecing the prophecies of the scripture together, we see from other prophecies like Ezekiel 38, Joel chapter 3, Zechariah 14, Luke 21, come forward into Revelation chapter 16, you piece those prophecies together and suddenly you have a very full picture. It's just like any event that happens in life. Innocent bystanders observe from different perspectives. The Bible gives us those different perspectives to look at. Tonight, we're going to look at it from the perspective of Daniel, a man who was looking at it from his perspective, and what he was interested is in this section of land, the Holy Land. That's what was important to him. So that's the focus that we're going to have a look at, particularly tonight as we work from verse 40 through to the end of the chapter. In the following weeks, we're going to have a look at how that works in together with lots of other Bible prophecies. But for tonight, we're going to focus on that.
Where did you do the comic?
I was outsourced. Yeah.
Many ships and many chariots,
Yes?
I think it says.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. Let's work through the verses though. Beginning up here at verse 40, let's work through phrase by phrase to come to an understanding of what this section of Daniel chapter 11 is talking about. In front of you all, I've put out a sheet, Daniel chapter 11, verse 40. Work through, highlight things, note the language, look at it carefully. Travis highlighted to us in the first section how important it is to read very carefully. How many kings did we have in Media and Persia? 3 plus 1, plus the one that Daniel was standing in front of, didn't we? So that made 5. That's how carefully we need to read. So as we read this section, let's, I guess, try and draw out some of the images and some of the details so that next week we can go and have a look at what's happening out there on the world scene and see how history and how future events are all pointing in the right direction for fulfillment of these verses. So, the first phrase is, at the time of the end. You say, well, what does the time of the end refer to? It's the time of the end of the kingdoms of men. The beginning of God's world. But that language, the time of the end, is very consistent through the Bible. It's language that matches with the latter days, the last days, end times, used in those prophecies I mentioned earlier in a consistent way. And it can sometimes talk about a period of about 100 years of history. That's what it's talking about here in Daniel chapter 11. But it's a time of history that talks about nations coming to a climax in Armageddon. It talks about the return of Jesus Christ. It talks about the time of the setting up of God's kingdom. So lots of ideas and lots of things occur in this final period at the time of the end. Now you might think that's a large period of time. Keep in mind, 2,500 year prophecy. So at the time of the end, we're going to have the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. So here we have again our two kings. Remember from Travis's presentation earlier, we had the king that was across the top of Israel and the king down the bottom. Now I ask you to read carefully in that verse. How many kings do we have in verse 40?
2.
2, absolutely. If we read the context though, we'd come to realise there's 3. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at a third king. There's a semicolon, full colon here. And the king of the north shall come against this same third king like a whirlwind. On face value, we could think that they were pushing at each other, couldn't we?
If you're saying 3.
There's potentially 3 kings, because as we follow through in the context of Daniel chapter 11, from verse 36 we will see the king. Verse 37 and 38 talks about he, him, his, all the way through. Through to verse 39, we come to verse 40, which reintroduces these 2 kings of the north and south, while this he, this him, is still being referred to. So just as Travis has coloured in his Bible in yellows and blues, grab a third colour and colour in the hymns of verse 36 through to verse 41 or 40. Okay? Because it helps you distinguish what we're talking about.
So you say, the king of the south shall push at him,
Yep.
so he comes. That's what it says. The king of the south shall come.
Sure.
So he's
What does it mean to push though?
to come against him.
Read it carefully. Did it say we'll destroy? Think about some of the language that was used back in earlier on in Daniel chapter 11.
Yeah.
Very carefully worded. So the king of the south is going to push at this other third king.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, if you're pushing, you assume you're just making someone retreat back,
Maybe.
maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah? Maybe agitating them
Would you
in
show
the
the
process?
muscle a little bit?
Showing it a little bit, but you're not destroying the person, are you? You're not flattening them, you're not destroying them.
Didn't say that.
Absolutely. All right, what I'm going to propose to you, and I don't have the time tonight to prove all of it, we can do it in future weeks. I'm going to propose to you that what we are talking about here is the Ottoman Empire. You remember Travis was talking in verse 36, 37 about the Roman Empire. Well, as that declined, the Ottoman Empire started to grow. In the 1300s, it started to grow from a little town here. Can you tell me the name of that town?
Constantinople.
Constantinople. And it grew, and it got quite large. In the 1700s, it was quite a large empire. But come to 1912, just before the First World War, it was starting to contract. And that's because by this time, we see powers like England had taken control of Egypt. And we come to the First World War and we see that the Ottoman Empire, which was governed or headquartered here by Turkey, Turkey sided with Germany in the First World War. And the consequence of that was they then became an enemy of the British state. And so Britain pushed the Ottoman Empire back up to post-World War, a small little empire. Come forward now into 2014, we say who? The Ottoman Empire? What?
So should the resurrection take place there, or still got a way to go?
I'd say you've still got a bit of time to go because there's a semicolon in verse 40. Come and have a look at verse 40. Come and see where it has a colon there in verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
Colon. And the king of the north will come against him. Now what I'm proposing to you is we haven't seen that. So we are living in that colon. We're living in that time period of history, in that changeover. Let's come back to here. The changeover between the time when the king of the south, which, yes, was coming up from Egypt, but was it Egypt? No, it wasn't. It was actually the British forces were pushing.
Yeah.
We're going to see a time where there's going to be a pushing from the north downwards. And generally speaking, without going through all the detail of it, simply for time, it's going to be a Russian power. We can prove that to you by the names that were given to in Ezekiel 38. Okay? But for now, please take my word, the king of the north in the future, we believe, is going to be a Russian power that's going to come down against him. Now, let's have a look at some of this language. I've been up front with you, told you where we think it's heading. Let's pick through some of this imagery so that we're ready for next week when we actually start laying the Bible prophecy over the top of world events that we're seeing occurring now. What are we going to see? We're going to see this king of the north come against him like a whirlwind. Now, what does a whirlwind conjure up in your mind?
Storm.
A storm.
Destruction.
Destruction. Does it come slowly? Does it come quickly?
Quickly.
Very quickly. Okay, so there's all these ideas. He's going to come with chariots. So his ground-based invasion with horsemen, with many ships. Now you might say, well, that's what Daniel understood. If Daniel wrote about modern aircraft, he wouldn't have understood it, would he? He wouldn't know what he is talking about. So he's got to write in his language.
You know what that word chariot means, Ian? Tank.
Tank, does it?
Yeah.
Okay.
In Hebrew.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Which makes it quite black and white, you know.
Quite strong.
You know, we're not looking at tanks anymore. We've got, sorry, we're not looking at chariots
Chariots and
anymore.
horsemen anymore, absolutely. But what it tells us, there'll be ground as well as there will be ships. Now, potentially, is a whirlwind just talking about speed, or is it talking about an offensive which will come from the air? Who knows? We're only going to know in hindsight. And we need to be extremely careful when we try to predict what Daniel means. We can look at these ideas, we can create mental pictures of what we think Daniel is talking about, but these things have not occurred. We need to look for it, we need to be hoping to see what we expect from what we can see, what we can interpret, but it'll only be in hindsight. Travis has dealt in hindsight and been able to go bit by bit, step by step, and quite conclusively say that event was this and that event was that, because it all fits in historically. We can't do that with these verses. I think it's interesting though that when we talk about the ships, it does actually mention there will be a lot of ships. And I think that's very important. We'll come to see that when we look at what's going on in this area of the Middle East. All right? So circle that phrase there, with many ships. He shall enter into the countries, plural. Okay, so we're not talking about just one nation that he's going to annex. We're not talking about just one little peninsula, the Crimea, or Crimea. We're talking about countries, plural, lots. In fact, he's going to overflow and pass over. Now you think about that imagery. That's not the imagery of we'll attack over there and we'll do a bit down there. That's the process of rolling out. A flood doesn't jump over things, it just covers everything in its path. Okay?
The word chariots is separated there. That's because it's chariots with the plural. And it means literally that tanks.
Yep.
In our
In a modern language.
language.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Right. Note that in, scribble it in, get it in the notes, because we need to look at it next week as we go through it.
Right.
All right. Verse 41. If he's coming down, overflowing and passing over countries, inevitably he's going to come to a point where he's going to enter also into the glorious land. Now, from Daniel's perspective, there's no guessing which is the glorious land. Other translations might say Holy Land. Some might say Promised Land. Okay? We're talking about Israel, Palestine. So he's going to come down and pass through. Now, does it actually say that he's going to invade here? When we talk about that phrase of the glorious land. Sorry? Not necessarily. Just notice that. Because I think it's interesting that it says he's going to enter also into the glorious land. Yes, many shall be overthrown. And I take the word countries here in italics, meaning it's not there in the original. So there's going to be some destruction, but is his intention to destroy Israel in verse 41?
Well,
I'm going to propose...
You think you just use the same context as the previous verse, if that's what he's meaning.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just highlighting it though to focus on the language carefully, because I'm going to propose to you that his purpose to destroy Israel actually comes later down here. We're going to see it in one of the later verses. Okay? I think what we'll find is he's almost bypassing in some ways, which was not unusual for the kings of the north and the south back in ancient history. They were using that area of land almost as a thoroughfare to be able to attack the king in the north or to come down and attack the king in the south. All right, but these shall escape out of his hand. Who's going to escape? Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. Now you might say, well, who are they? They're ancient names of countries that I don't know. Well, go and get an ancient map. And here you see the section of the kingdom of Israel, what we would today call Palestine, down here into Gaza. And down on this side of the Jordan, we have the kingdom of Ammon. On this side here, we have the kingdom of Moab. And down here at the bottom, we have the kingdom of Edom. In the modern world, we'd call that Jordan. So it tells us, if we go back, it tells us that Jordan shall escape out of his hand. So this invasion is not going to attack Jordan. Very specific, isn't it? It's a very narrow tract of land that's being followed down along the coast. He's going to stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. All right, so we're down to the bottom already. All right? Now, does an alarm bell ring in anybody's mind when we say that the land of Egypt shall not escape? Remember what Travis was asking you to think critically? Look critically at the language and why certain names and titles are used.
Egypt's the territory of that king of the south previously.
Absolutely. So now why is it called the land of Egypt?
Because
It's a different designation to it.
A different designation?
Well, it's no longer under control of the king of the south.
Okay. Up here, in verse 40, it was the king of the south that was pushing the Ottoman Empire back up. Was that king of the south Egypt? Or was it another foreign power who was in Egypt at the time, pushing the Ottoman Empire back up through Palestine, through Lebanon, through Syria, up towards Turkey? It was Egypt. Sorry, it was not Egypt. Egypt at that time was broke. It was British power. Sorry. The British were the ones who were in Egypt. They'd taken over the power of Egypt. Why? Because they were so concerned about the Suez Canal. They just invested millions in building, and it looked like they were going to lose power of it. So they took over the government. They took control of Egypt and then started pushing back up come the First World War. And so that's why I think we need to read very carefully the language, because here you see a change. So this king that was there in verse 40 is no longer the king come verse 42. No longer the power that's in Egypt. We're back to Egypt now. When? Can anyone tell me when was it that the British pulled out of Egypt? When did they pull out of Palestine? 48, end of World War I. World War II, all around those times, they were slowly withdrawing, to the point of 1948, they're out of Israel as well. Okay? So that's the section that's occurring at the point of this colon here. The time where, yes, the British have done their job of pushing, and we are now waiting for this king of the north to come very suddenly, overflow, pass over, down to the point where he ends up here in the land of Egypt. The land of Egypt will not be able to run away. But notice the next verse. Verse 43, it says, he shall, I'll put us to the next slide. Here's verse 43, so the last few verses. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Now you might think, well, Egypt, what are the precious things of Egypt? It's a broken nation. And the Bible prophesies that Egypt will be a broken nation. It'll be a weak nation. It'll be a nothing nation at end times. It says that to us in the Bible. So do we have a contradiction here that potentially there's treasures of gold, of silver and precious things in Egypt? Well, I've already mentioned the Suez Canal. It's an invaluable shipping path. Very important. Look at it militarily, it gives you an awful lot of access outside of merely the Mediterranean. We'll come back to that next week and look at that more. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. What does that mean? He's come down from the north, down into the land of Egypt, and at the end it just says that the Ethiopians and the Libyans will be at his steps. Does that mean they will be the next stride that this power will step into? Does it mean that they'll be bowing down at his feet?
I think it's the next step.
Supportive, the next step. Who knows? I'm not sure what that phrase actually means, and we don't know because it's prophetic, it's future. We've got to wait. What we do know is that the Libyans and the Ethiopians are going to be involved, and they're going to be submissive to this northern invasion. On what terms? We don't know. It doesn't really matter. Because the reality of the story is that at the point where he comes here to Egypt and the Ethiopian and the Libyans submit to him, he's going to hear some tidings out of the east and out of the north that will trouble him. Now, if you're in Egypt and you go east, north, north, east, whatever order you want to call it, out in that direction, where do you come to? Back into the lands of Israel, Sinai, that desert peninsula area. Okay, so he's going to hear tidings that come out of that section. They're going to trouble him. And therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy. And this is where I'm saying to you, this is potentially when he turns his back on Egypt, comes back to Israel with the intention of decimating the nation. Initially, it was merely about thoroughfare. Whereas
Ethiopia is taken over for the water.
potentially,
I mean, that's life.
potentially. I mean, it doesn't say that here, but that's potentially one of the big draw cards for him. Who knows? Yep. So he's drawn back to potentially Israel to destroy with great fury and to utterly take or to make away with many. Okay? Now you'll notice our graphic at the end had a picture of Putin, potentially Putin, standing there in Egypt, but his flag is placed. Did anyone notice?
Ukraine?
In Jerusalem. His flag is very carefully placed in Jerusalem. Have a look at what verse 45 says. He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace. Now that's the old way of saying he's going to set up his headquarters. He's going to plant the tents of his palatial tents. We've got an empire that's on the march. In ancient times, when they didn't have modern means of transport, they would carry things with them. And so they'd set up tents along the way. Well, this is where the headquarters of the tents is going to be set up. And it's going to be between the seas. Now, if you're in Egypt and you've just gone back northeast, there is a sea there, isn't there? It's called the Dead Sea. It's a very mountainous region where Jerusalem is based. And just a little bit further over is the Mediterranean. He's going to plant this headquarters between the seas, plural, in the glorious, holy mountain. And again, we see that same language that we saw earlier referring to the glorious land. So that's where the headquarters will be. And it's at that point where the headquarters are set up and it looks like the battle's been won, yet he shall come to his end, and no one will be there to help him. So when it looks like the battle's been won, he's achieved so much, he's covered so much ground to come from the north all the way down through all these countries to invade, to turn back, to settle another dispute, and it looks like the settlement has occurred. It's at that point that he'll be destroyed. And we're going to propose to you that's the return of Jesus Christ. That's the time where Jesus Christ will get involved in the kingdoms of men. And it'll be the end of the times of the world as we know it. And Jesus Christ will set up his kingdom. That's what we're going to get to in the third week. So give us time. We'll get to be able to demonstrate that section of it. But for all of this evasion, it'll fall apart and fail at the very end when it looks to be the most stable.